I want to begin with the question of what do you think it means to trust somebody this morning? Have you thought about that? Like what all is required to trust other people? It sounds like a simple question, but it's really not. Trust is very, very, very difficult. It requires vulnerability. We effectively place ourselves in someone else's hands. Trust requires letting go of control and trusting outcomes that we can't or shouldn't carry ourselves. At its core, trust is relying upon the character and faithfulness of somebody other than you. So that's trust. So how good are you at trusting people? I think it's pretty difficult for us to trust. We might relate to that cat right there. Not keeping one eye, but keeping both eyes razor sharp on other people. And so often in life, trust changes with us. So when we're young, we tend to trust easy, right? Because we don't know the heartbreak of getting older. As we age, we so often get burned. Promises are broken. People fail us because we're all fallible human beings. And slowly, trust becomes harder and harder. Maybe not because we want to, but because we've been hurt. And then out of that hurt, so often cynicism will grow, and we have this pain that we carry with us. And because we've been hurt, we try to protect ourselves, and we stereotype people, we rush to judgment, and before long, we begin to isolate. We don't trust anybody. And we can drift towards unhealthy extremes. On one end, we could be too trusting, right? Naive, unguarded, undiscerning. And those people are easy targets, right? For us to look at and say, well, they're just being young, immature. But the other extreme could be just as damaging, if not more so. And both lead to the same place, that of isolation. Isolation could look like pulling us away from people altogether. It could also look like being surrounded by people and trusting none of them. Either way, we end up lonely, guarded, and disconnected. And so that's not how God designed us to live. He designed us to trust others. And if we have to avoid these two extremes, the easy way out is to trusting, then how should we trust others? It takes humility and wisdom. It takes healing from our past wounds. It takes clear communication, boundaries, and expectations, and accountability. When you add all that up, trust begins to feel expensive, right? And maybe we begin to feel like, well, maybe it's just easier to trust no one and get on with it. I once had a pastor tell me, and I worked for this pastor, he said, you should trust no one. I don't think that's the most encouraging advice to give a young pastor as they're just starting off in ministry. Trust no one. If we live that way, we're isolated, never knowing others and being truly known. But there is one that we can trust, one who will never fail us, as we just sang about, and that is the Lord. All of us probably here trust God, at least to some degree. We sing about it. We just sang some songs of trust. We'll sing more songs about trust later. We talk about trust. But there's a question I want to challenge you with today. Is there room in your heart to trust God more this morning? A faith that never grows in trust is a stagnant faith. It's a dead faith. And God calls us to a faith that deepens through every season of life that we go through. I hope that none of you, and I hope that I'm not, satisfied with the level of trust we have in the Lord. That's why the old hymn still resonates so well today. Singing these familiar words, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus saith the Lord." And that's the hymn writer's perspective on what trust looks like. It's God says it, I believe it, and I'm going to rest in his promises, and I'm going to know it because he said it. And then there's the famous second half of the chorus that says, "Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust him more." And that's a prayer that I think all of us should be praying. And we're going to sing the song at the end of the sermon. But I really want us to prepare our hearts. Would we have the attitude, "Lord, teach me to trust you more"? It's a grace, it's a joy, it's a gift to be able to trust the Lord more. Today we're stepping into a chapter that demands immense trust. In Exodus chapter 2, we meet two faithful Levite parents living under brutal opposition. They're commanded to do the unthinkable, to surrender their child to death. But instead, they choose to trust the Lord with his life. In this chapter, we're going to see what trusting the Lord looks like, what it looks like when we trust ourselves instead of the Lord. And then we'll look at why trust takes time, especially through suffering and waiting. And the book of Exodus is written by Moses in the 15th century BC, and he's actually, this is happening real time. He's recording the events, the history of the Israelites as they traveled to the promised land out of slavery in Egypt. And they're on their journey from slavery to freedom. And fittingly, that lesson begins with a baby, a basket, and a family who chose faith over fear. And so first, let's look at what trusting God looks like. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And so we want to look at this baby and what the family does to protect the baby when he was born. We do know quite a bit about this couple. We know their names. They're not mentioned here in this chapter, but their names are Amram and Jochebed. Amram, he's the husband, and his name means exalted people. Jochebed is the wife, and her name means the Lord is glory, or Yahweh is glorious. Aren't those names incredible? They're not just incredible because they're beautiful names, but they're incredible because they're named this as the people of God are in slavery, undergoing intense persecution under the oppression of slave masters. It tells us a little bit about the state of the Israelites about 350 years into their captivity in Egypt, and it's amazing. Their faith and their identity is continued to stay strong in their faith and trust in the Lord. And yet, here they are hiding their son. Now, why would they have to hide their newborn son? It seems a little strange. Well, the answer is just in the previous verses. In Exodus 1, verse 22, Pharaoh gave the order to all his people, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And so here Pharaoh issued this edict for all the people under his authority in Egypt, whether it be the Hebrews or Egyptians, whoever it is, saying that if a baby boy is born, he's going to be drowned to death in the Nile. And it's really interesting when you look at the timing, because we know Amram and Jochebed had an older daughter and an older son. We find this from Scripture. The son was 3 years old when this baby boy was born here in chapter 2, and their older daughter is probably around 10 years old. So they've been married at least 10 plus years, and the son's born. That this young couple, they are experiencing trials, tribulations. They're experiencing persecution real time. This is their first child since Pharaoh's edict was issued, and they're living these perilous times. And so here they chose to hide their young newborn son. And they hid him for 3 months. This is a great time to reminisce, if you've got a child, what it was like those first 3 months of the baby's life. And it could be such a sweet time, right? It's a hard time, but it's a sweet time. And when you see the baby, and when the baby gets mad, he's still just completely cute, right? He's throwing his arms and this whimpering cry, and you just love it, and it's so cute, except at 2 and 3 in the morning when he's waking you up every 2 to 3 hours, right, for food. They're completely fragile, completely helpless, and they're soft and needing constant attention. And here Amram and Jochebed, they choose to hide this child for the first 3 months of his life, which is a capital offense. You can't defy the most powerful person in the world and not be punished for it. They're defying Pharaoh, risking their lives. These would have been 90 intense days. Not only are they nurturing the life of their young son, they're maintaining secrecy, keeping him indoors at all times. And whenever you have people walking by and knocking on the door, their hearts are beating faster. They're putting their lives on the line because they love their baby son. Every knock on the door could be an invitation for death. But they save him because he's a, quote, fine child. Sometimes when I'm reading the Bible, I read a word and I'm like, that's a terrible word to use. How many of us think fine is a really good thing? How are you doing? I'm fine. That's not what it sounds like or what it does. The word here is the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 1. When God created the world, he called it tov, or good, right? So I don't know why the translators of the NIV decided to say he's a fine child. Whatever be, it sounds like something negative. Other translations use words like special or beautiful, or the King James says he's a goodly child. And so here, what's happening is Jochebed, Moses' mother, saw her child as precious, as valuable, as worth protecting, as good, worth risking her life for. And Hebrews 11:23, as Jim read, reflects on this moment. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And so here, these parents, they perceived something special about him. This is a son they recognized in faith as precious and entrusted to the Lord. And because they, like the midwives, feared God and valued human life, they put their lives at risk by defying Pharaoh. They couldn't kill their son. They stepped out in faith and took steps to preserve his life. I think it's important for us to see the humanity in these characters in Scripture. I think so often we read the Bible, we read it flippantly. We take for granted the enormous sacrifices that these characters are taking. That Amram and Jochebed, as they're raising their young infant son, that they have a plan. And we see this plan unfolding in the next few verses, and it's a beautiful plan, and trusting God, but also taking steps of courageous faith. Everything they're about to do has been carefully thought out and prayed over and surrendered to the Lord. I hope you see that. When Jochebed could hide her young son no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And so all this is perfectly orchestrated and carried out in faith. First, we see that there's a basket prepared. The Hebrew word here is the same word used earlier to describe the ark. And so it's not a basket, it's the ark that she places the child into, and prepared in the same way of covering with pitch. And picture this. Picture Jochebed having the child, and across those 3 months, she not only is preparing and taking care of him, she's preparing this ark for him, made up of papyrus reeds, weaving them together carefully, sealing them tight with tar and pitch, and strong enough to float. And you have a situation where, once again, the hope of God's people is being placed in an ark, a rudderless, sailless boat being put out in the water just to follow wherever God leads. And here we're trusting, she was trusting the Lord to preserve and protect his people, and they're completely at his mercy. And so then she places him among the reeds, and here you see some papyrus that's growing along the Nile River. So this is a picture of the Nile River, and you can see the papyrus reeds that are growing up there. And so this helps form the backdrop for what's actually happening in Exodus chapter 2. And so I think it's really important for us to have this picture in mind. These reeds are abundant, they're thick, they're tall along the bank of the Nile. You can't tell it from the picture, but these are between 6 to 10 feet tall. I'm 6 feet tall. And so these are very, very tall reeds that are there bunched up on the side of the Nile. And this choice of putting the baby, putting the ark in the reeds is a very strategic one. Have you seen The Prince of Egypt, that movie, animated cartoon? I think it's late 90s. Not many people said yes. Hopefully you've seen it. Or you've seen depictions of Moses being placed in the Nile River. And so oftentimes you see that these are cartoon animated things. But if you watch The Prince of Egypt, the sequence is harrowing. It's Hollywood. It's you have Moses' parents kind of put him off and kind of shove him off into the Nile, and then you see this basket. And this basket goes through these like whitewater rapids, and it's just like dipping in and out, and you've got like birds that are swooping in, threatening the life of the child, and you have crocodiles that are snapping. That's complete Hollywood. It is, yeah, and we should laugh at it, right? But unfortunately, this is sometimes what comes into our mind if we don't clearly study Scripture. That here you've got this baby placed among the reeds, and he's stationary. He's not floating down the river. Amram and Jochebed would never do that to their baby son. This is all part of a plan carefully prayed through, they're not just haphazardly throwing their son into the river. And then also the position of their son was very important. They positioned the baby where he may be found by somebody with a shred of compassion who could take care of him. This would be in the Nile Delta region in Goshen, where people would often come in to bathe. And think about the significance of, and by the way, Nathaniel got up and reminded me, when we last watched this as a family, Nathaniel was a little boy and Samuel was a baby. And as I remember watching this, and Nathaniel was saying, "No, baby Samuel! No, baby, you can't do the baby Samuel!" And just this idea of how horrific that would be. Not like that at all, okay? So doesn't it make you feel better this morning? I don't know if you needed that comfort, but here it is, that the parents of this young child had a heart. But think about this. Jochebed putting her child into these reeds. Can you imagine that, mothers? We can't even imagine that. What it would be like to put your child that you dearly love into this situation in the Nile River in these reeds. What love, what sorrow. Because Jochebed is a point where she realizes she's done all that she can do. She's at the end of the road. And she's done all she could do to physically protect her infant son. And here she is surrendering the baby to the Lord and letting go. We've got a lot to learn from the faith of this woman here in this chapter. And so she places the little baby in the reeds. And that's not all. It's easy to forget the other character in this. The older sister, Miriam, stood at a distance, waiting, praying, observing. And I'd like to think, because we're talking about a stationary basket here, that if things don't turn out like they're hoping, that she would retrieve the baby. A little speculative, but I think that's what's happening. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. And so we see how God is providing for this baby and for this family in the midst of their peril. In God's providence, Pharaoh's daughter went to this very spot to bathe. She saw the basket among the reeds. And this is actually very significant because the basket is probably made of the same stuff where the reeds are, right? It'd be easy for it to blend in. You do have the tar and pitch on it. But here she catches the side of it, and she sends her female servant to go get it. You thought about how significant it is that it's Pharaoh's daughter that finds and discovers this baby? You think about it. What other women could stand up to Pharaoh? All right? What other women would have Pharaoh's heart to the point where he would allow this to happen? And so Pharaoh's daughter, God in his providence, provides just the right woman to spot this basket. And then she opened it, and she saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. So here you've got Pharaoh's daughter full of compassion, protective compassion. There's a kind of feeling that moves someone to action. And there's this desire to spare the child, to show mercy. If you've heard a baby crying, it's like there's something in us that just moves us to want to make the baby smile. It makes us speak in high languages, right? To shake the rattles or sing or rock the baby or whatever it takes to get the baby to stop crying, because there's just something in us that's compassionate about little babies. And so Pharaoh's daughter has compassion, and she notices that it's a Hebrew baby. Well, how would she know it's a Hebrew baby? He's been circumcised, right? And so she would have been able to see that. Also, what other kind of baby would be in the Nile? And so she knew that this must be one of the Hebrew babies. And so what's she going to do? She's thinking through, maybe some poor mother would have been forced into the situation, and here the baby is all afraid, crying out, alone and in peril. Is she going to save this baby? If she saves the baby, it's going to go against her father. She's uniquely positioned to be able to do that. There's practical issues to consider, like what about the other members of her family? Is there room for another? What's going to be said? What's going to be done? There's a lot of things that she's got to figure out in this moment. But in this moment, we've got a hero that steps into action. Miriam, his older sister, asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Isn't this phenomenal? Because here, Miriam's been watching the basket, her eye on that. She's been seeing her little brother crying. She's withheld herself from going and intervening. She's just sitting there, trusting God, doing what she was told. And then when she sees these women gather around the basket, she rushes up. And she offers a suggestion to someone far more powerful than she. She's just a little girl, maybe 10 years old. And she talks to Pharaoh's daughter and says, "Hey, I saw you hesitating. I've got an idea. If you want to save the life of this baby, I could go. I can help you. Would you like for me to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you?" Isn't that awesome? We don't spend enough time appreciating the faith of Miriam here in verse 7, for her to step out and do this. It's genius, it's boldness, it's faith. And then listen into the words of Pharaoh's daughter. It's incredible how God provides here. She said, "Yes, great idea. Go get a Hebrew woman to nurse this child for me." And so Miriam went and got the baby's mother, Jochebed. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. So here, just picture this. The mother who had just lovingly laid her child into the reeds in the Nile River, trusting God, heartbroken, is suddenly, pretty quickly, reunited with her son, and she's able to see his face again. And it's just incredible. And then Pharaoh, she's standing in front of Pharaoh's daughter, who says to him, "Hey, take this boy, and I'm going to pay you to nurse him." So can you imagine here? She sees the hand of God all over this, where by God's providence, he provides the right woman in the right situation to provide for her. And instead of working out all the hard labor, she's paid to nurse the child. It's incredible. And she's actually being paid here. And God had faithfully provided for this family. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." And I haven't been saying his name because I think it's important for us to be really thinking about the child and not being distracted by our preconceived notions about who Moses is. But yes, this is Moses, this is his origin. And here you have Jochebed, who's once again having to surrender her son. And she gives her son over to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter adopts Moses as her very own child. And this is difficult. Jochebed had her son back for probably 3 to 4 years, nursing him. He got to hear his mother's voice and his family's faith, and he got to learn about his Hebrew identity. And he got to hear the stories of God, of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so he's raised up in the faith as much as you can for a 3 or 4 year old. And this is where the name Moses came from. And he's one who's drawn out of the Nile and out of death. And here he's surrendered back by his mother to Pharaoh's daughter. What does trusting God look like today? I think the story of Jochebed is just such an incredible picture of what trusting God looks like, and I hope you can resonate with some of it. I'd say that the place that trusting God begins with is obvious. It's so obvious we overlook it a lot. The first is prayer. That we need to be putting our troubles and our trials in the Lord's hands. Like that's the very first step. God, I've got this situation. I need your wisdom. I need your help. I need you to move. And so trusting God begins with prayer. We don't try to carry our circumstances alone. Trusting God also involves trusting God's promises, trust is really faith in action. So it's believing that God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he'll do. And then not just believing that, but acting on it. And so we step out believing and trusting the promises of God. If God says we ought to do it, we do it, even if we don't feel like it. So often the trusting God looks illogical. It's not always illogical, but so often it does. What Amram and Jochebed did was completely illogical. Why would you put your lives at risk for this little baby? He's just going to be found out and killed anyway. Why are you putting all this effort? You're going to put the baby in the Nile. He's just going to die a long, slow, excruciating death. You might as well just end it now. And so it was illogical from a human wisdom perspective for them to have done what they did. Likewise, for us, so often following God's promises is illogical. Going against all of our instincts, going against worldly wisdom. Why would you spend all this time studying the Word? Why would you give? Why would you serve? Why would you care? Why would you do these things? Why would you respond to hatred with peace and gentleness? All these things that we're called to do, so often, so many of them are illogical. Trusting God requires action. We need like Amram and Jochebed, the courage to act, to step out in faith. We say we believe, let's follow through, let's act on what we say we believe. It also looks like surrender. Now, surrender is when we let God write the story. We understand that we're not in control of all things. God can write a far better story than we can. And we need to trust him with the outcome. Even like Amram and Jochebed, they did all they could, but then they surrendered the child twice, saying, Lord, we trust this child into your hands. And it's really interesting. What happens when we always get our way? So often the things that we really want are things that end up really hurting us in the end. And so we need to live a surrendered life before the Lord. And ultimately what this is, trusting God is not something that God wants us to do just because he likes to see us suffer. Trusting God is not something that he needs us to do for himself. Trusting God, ultimately, at its core, is a choice to be filled with peace. As it says in Philippians 4, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Trust God in every situation. And then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So choosing to trust God is a choice, is choosing to be peaceful. I can't do this. I'm not going to stress over it. I'm not going to try to control it. I'm going to surrender it and let God do with it what he wills. We get to experience his perfect peace. Also, as 1 Peter 5:7 says, is a familiar great passage, cast all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you. And so these are the choices we have in front of us. Do we choose to trust? Do we choose to be filled with God's peace? When life presents us with impossible dilemmas, we must choose to trust Christ. We can surrender our anxieties and know that we are safe in his arms. And so this is a really good picture by Moses' parents. But we see here what it looks like to trust our own selves. A much uglier picture than the one we just read about. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And so let's look at what Moses is doing here and how he takes control of the situation where he should be letting go. So Moses, we know that he's 40 years old because of Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7. So he grew up, he's 40, and he walks out observing his people. Now, he knew he was a Hebrew. He knew he was an Israelite. He had been reminded of that constantly because he bore the mark of God's people. And so it wasn't like some surprise that was shoved on him. I'm a Hebrew all of a sudden. He knew. And so don't let the Hollywood narratives fool you. And so he walks out to observe his people, and he sees their suffering. They're carrying heavy burdens and heavy loads. They're going through the oppression under these slave masters, and he saw their suffering. He looked closely and perceived. He saw the injustice that was there, and it bothered him greatly. And in one particular instance of this, he sees a slave master who is beating another. And so here, picture this. Just repeatedly, mercilessly, this Egyptian is striking, maybe with a whip, maybe with rods, causing this Hebrew man to bleed. There's a possibility of permanent injury, the likelihood of permanent injury. There's a likelihood of death. And if someone didn't stop this Egyptian, the Israelite was probably going to die. And Moses is making that correlation. Hey, this is one of my own people. And so he looks this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and then hid him in the sand. This is murder. He looked this way and that. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He's trying to cover his tail. And yet he reached out and he struck the Egyptian and killed the Egyptian. Instead of doing things God's way, he chose to take it into his own hands and do it his way. And then he tried to cover it up. He hid the body in the sand. And if we pause just for a moment, this is pretty futile, right? Like no one's going to notice that one of the Egyptian slave drivers went missing? Like Pharaoh's going to not find out about this? Hiding the body is going to somehow absolve him of the blame? And if Moses was able to dodge responsibility for this murder, who's going to take the blame? Probably the Hebrew that was getting mauled. Or maybe if he held his peace about it, all of the Hebrew people would undergo more suffering, because we've all seen how Pharaoh responds to challenges is to ratchet up the temperature. Moses would have known this, but he tried to cover it up. And this is going to lead to a bad place. But then Moses, he goes back to his home and he gets a night's sleep. We don't know how good of a night's sleep he had, but he thought he could get away with the murder, and so then he goes back to normal. What we see here, this is a picture of self-reliance, that Moses had the right instincts, but the wrong timing, the wrong method. He's wanting justice to be done, but he took it into his own hands to accomplish. Right motives do not justify sinful methods. The next day, Moses went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And so he goes back out, kind of bold of him. Maybe he's curious. He's trying to figure out if anyone figured out the whole thing about the dead Egyptian slave driver, if they found the body or those things. He goes out to observe again. And was there commotion about the missing slave driver? He saw their suffering again. But this time, it was self-imposed suffering, where one Hebrew was violently beating another Hebrew. One Hebrew was in the wrong. And so he asks him a question. Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? That's a really good question. What he's really saying is, you guys are family. Don't you see your brothers? Why are you hitting one another? What are you doing? And he's saying, you're in the wrong here. But the man answered a question with a question. Don't you hate it when people do this to you? You ask a question, and they respond with another question, and you're like, well, duh, you're probably right here. And this Hebrew who's in the wrong, who's been beating his fellow Hebrew, dismantles Moses' actions with a few quick questions. One, he said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" That is a really harsh question, right? Who made you ruler and judge over us? Effectively, he's saying, who are you? Who made you ruler? Who made you prince or official? Who gave you the authority to tell us what to do? Who put you in charge? And so this Hebrew, who quite literally has blood on his hands from beating another Hebrew, turns to Moses and says, "Who made you ruler?" He challenges him. "Who made you judge?" A person who gets to decide disputes and administer justice. So here this Hebrew is saying, you don't get to decide what's right or wrong for us. You've not been appointed by God or by us. Who are you? And then he goes on, asks another question. "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" He says, "Hey, you're a murderer. You killed the Egyptian for beating a Hebrew. Are you going to kill me too, like you killed the Egyptian? You're a murderer." And actually what he does here is a benefit to Moses, because he tips Moses off that what he's done has been known. Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must become known. And so Moses all of a sudden is afraid. He's terrified of the consequences of his actions. He's terrified of authority and punishment. He's been exposed. He's been compromised. He tried to do things his way. It was a bad idea. He stepped out and trusting his own self, not relying upon God, and he's filled with fear. So while he saw injustice correctly, he felt compassion rightly, he acted without calling. And this teaches us a really crucial lesson, that right motives do not replace God's authorization. That the right thing done the wrong way is the wrong thing. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went on to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And I showed this graph, this timeline last week. We'll probably walk through this a little bit. But this is probably what's going on here. We're probably looking at the disappearance into Midian happening during the reign of Thutmose III. He is the son of Hatshepsut and co-regent with her for a little while. So this is probably just FYI, Thutmose III that we're looking at. This is the Pharaoh that tries to kill Moses. And so Moses ran away from Pharaoh. He ran away from his people, the ones he was trying to save. He saw that he'd failed in his efforts to free them. He ran away from Egypt, from Pharaoh's daughter, from his home, from the privilege. Now he's a fugitive with nothing and no one. Reminds me of Jacob's flight where he left his father with nothing but his staff. Now, he fled to the land of Midian. So he probably went about 200 to 300 miles that he ran away. On the screen you could see Egypt here, and then you see the Sinai Peninsula, and then you see kind of a peace sign, that's the Red Sea. And Midian, where he probably went, was over just past the Gulf of Aqaba, or it's also called the Gulf of Iliat, if you're Israelis. So he went over there in that area of Midian. That's where he is. Here Moses gives us a picture of what it looks like not to trust the Lord. And just some litmus tests as far as what it looks like to not trust the Lord. Instead of surrender, it looks like control, that we want to do things our way. And we're thinking that we can handle things, that we can't trust others and trust God. We got to do it ourselves. So often trusting self looks like impatience, that we're not willing to wait. We try to force outcomes in our own timing rather than God's, and that creates disaster. So often trusting self is self-centered, where it's everything we see and how it impacts our orbit. How does this impact me? Things done out of fear, hurt, or self-preservation. And so we see self-reliance that's driven by pride, impatience, and fear. So often trusting self is inaction, of just taking it easy. It's not my problem. Someone else can deal with it. A failure to trust and follow God's leading. And ultimately, a decision to trust in ourselves or anything other than God is a choice to experience debilitating anxiety and uncertainty. It's the flip side of the choice to trust God and experience peace. Psalm 127 speaks to this. There's several passages I want to rapid fire at you because they're really powerful. Psalm 127, 1-2 talks about the person who does not trust the Lord. Unless the Lord builds the city, unless the Lord builds the house, it's laborers labor in vain. In vain you rise early and you stay up late. He grants sleep, rest, peace to those he loves. If we try to take it ourselves and do it ourselves, that's a route to anxiety and restlessness, not peace. Now, Proverbs 3, 5-6, the famous passage, says we are to trust in the Lord with all of our hearts, lean not on our own understanding. That leaning on ourselves misdirects our path, leading us to a place of lostness. Now, Proverbs 28, 26 puts it bluntly, and we can just about memorize this, right? Those who trust themselves are fools. Those who trust in themselves are fools. Can we say that about ourselves today? Can certainly say I've got foolish tendencies, and one of those is to trust in myself over the Lord. I think all of us share to that degree, which is why we need to pray that we trust God more and trust ourselves less. Scripture is blunt. Self-trust is not wisdom. It's danger, and it's a choice to be filled with anxiety. And so this morning we need to identify where pride or impatience may be driving us to force outcomes. And rather than that, choose instead to do things God's way and wait on his timing. And we do see in this third point that trust takes time. It's borne out through time. When Pharaoh heard this, the murder of the Egyptian, he tried to kill Moses. Moses fled. And here Moses is in Midian, and he sat down by a well. So here Moses has come to a place of safety. He's here sitting down by this well, hundreds of miles from home and his people. At least there's no immediate danger. Pharaoh's probably not going to send an army after him. He's learned his lesson. He's in exile. He's gone. He's no longer part of the picture. And so here he is. He's found a moment of peace, far removed from Egypt, like we saw on the graph, on the map. And then a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill their troughs to water their father's flock. And so here you see the picture, the introduction of these women. And here they are in Midian, in this kind of desert wilderness area. And we don't know what kind of priest that he was. We do know he came to faith in Yahweh later on, at least. And these 7 daughters came to water their father's flock, as you typically would do. They need water for their family, for their herds, so they live. But then some shepherds came along and drove them away. And Moses got up and came to the rescue and watered their flock. And so here you see Moses intervening between themselves and these shepherds. These shepherds came by and violently yelled at the women. They drove them away. They're forceful, they're aggressive, they're bullying. There's an abuse of power and strength here. These shepherds were denying the women the care they needed for themselves and their flock. And there's an element of peril for the women would the violence escalate. And so the women backed off in fear and let the shepherds have the water. But here Moses sees the injustice and he takes action. Moses intervened. And we've dogged on Moses a little bit for what he just did, but here is a picture of Moses' heart. He's a man who understands God's justice, and he's willing to put himself in harm's way to serve the Lord. He's got a strong sense of justice, and he stood up to these bullies and put himself between them and the daughters, putting himself at risk. And they're able to water their flock. When the girls returned to rule their father, another name for him is Jethro. It's very common to have dual names, and so it's Reuel or Jethro. And Jethro asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" And so evidently there's a habit of them getting used and abused at the well. And she says, "Wow, this is a pleasant surprise. You're back early." And the daughters answered their father, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." So Moses, after he's done chasing off the shepherds, actually went to the hard work to take care of these women. And then Reuel asks his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave him?" Again, piercing questions, right? Okay, this guy, he put his life on the line for you daughters. And then he watered your flock, and you just let him go? This sounds like a man that I'd like to know. He sounds like a man of character and quality. Why did you leave him? Why don't you go back and invite him to have something to eat? And so here, Moses gets a dinner invitation. And it's so special here that this happened, that there's actually people. He left his family, all of his friends, and everything that he knew. And now there's people that wanted to associate with him. Friends for who he was and for his heart, not his background or his position with Pharaoh and any of that. And it's wonderful that here he's surrounded by friends having dinner. Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses in marriage. So now he's got a home. He's got a job. He's able to stay and be a shepherd with these women, with his wife. And there's a word here. Again, I'm dogging on the NIV today, which I rarely do. But this word, Moses agreed, it's deeper than that. Your translation might say Moses was content. And content is a much better translation, I would say. Because here he is, he's content, he's at peace. That he's learning to trust, he's learning to let go. Here Exodus 2:21 marks a turning point for Moses. Instead of forcing a plan, chasing significance, he becomes content to stay where God has put him. And here he is, he's got the contentment, and it's trust that's learned through waiting. That Midian wasn't a detour, it was God's classroom, and he gets a wife out of it. So he's given that. She's a woman who loves him. We see good things about her later on. She embraces Yahweh fully. Zipporah means bird, for what it's worth. And so they have a happy life and start to their family together. And then Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I become a foreigner in a foreign land." So here he is. He's got his own son. And I see shades of Manasseh here, just like when Joseph was in Egypt, and he is given his wife, and he has children. He says, he calls the first one Manasseh. God's made me forget the trials of my past. And here he says, you know what? I'm a foreigner, but I'm happy here. Moses is acknowledging his reality and trusting God in the middle of it. But during that long period, and we see it's, again, from Acts 7, it's a period of 40 years, another 40 years, so Moses becomes 80 at the end of this time. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help, because their slavery went up to God. So God was listening, and he heard their cry for help. They're crying out to the Lord. And so this is a long period of 40 years, 4 decades. I know some of us might be thinking 40 years goes back pretty fast, but it is a long time, right? And during this period of time, Israelites are suffering. They're groaning. It's interesting because there's 2 words that are used here. There's the groaning and there's the crying out. The groaning, what that is, that's to sigh deeply. That's to be under so much pain, there's no words. You're groaning. You're moaning under pain. You're trying to express distress too deep for words. That's the situation of these Israelites. They've lost their freedom. They're under the whip of slave masters. They're suffering in slavery. And they cry out to the Lord. They're appealing urgently for deliverance. I'll tell you, for the 400 years, these Israelites, they maintain their faith. They maintain their identity. They're doing really well. Now, as you see later on in Exodus, they're not doing so well. But in the midst of their trials, they're actually maintaining their faith, and they're doing very well. And God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So here, God is listening. He's listening with attention. He's listening with an intention, attention and intention. He wants to hear and respond, to acknowledge and take responsibility. And he's remembering, not that God would ever forget, but what's really happening here is God remembered. It says it's time to act. I can no longer bear to watch my people suffer the way they have. And he remembers God's covenant with Abraham, which included 2 promises. We're familiar with the promise in Genesis 15:5. I'm going to make you as numerous as the sand of the shore, the sea on the skies, and I'm going to make you into great people. You're going to bless all people, right? We know and love that promise. The Israelites knew and loved that promise. But the forgotten promise of Genesis 15 we rarely talk about is when, in verse 13, the Lord promises Abraham, centuries prior to this, that your people are going to be enslaved in a nation not their own, but after 400 years, I'm going to bring them out and bring them to safety. God remembered, said it's time to act. It's been 400 years. And he's concerned, he's caring, he's watching. He's got this personal involvement. He had compassion upon them. And we get to see him spring into action in the next chapter. But what's important for us to know right now is that the Lord hears our cries. So I don't know what you're crying to the Lord about. Maybe you're just crying. Maybe you need to cry it to the Lord. But he hears our cries. He's not forgotten us. He watches over us and he cares for us. And we can choose to trust him daily. It might be choosing to trust him daily over a period of 40 years. It's a long time, right? But we should never give up crying to the Lord. So I want to transition to just some personal application. Is there an area of your life where you're struggling to trust the Lord? Is there an area of your life where you're struggling to trust the Lord? Because I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we stop and think about, what are the things that I'm worried about? What are the things that are bringing me anxiety? What are the areas where I'm trying to have control? What are the areas I need to surrender and let go, like Jochebed, of doing all that we can, but then trusting God with whatever precious thing it is that we're holding on to so tightly? Now, for some of us, maybe it's family. We could ask the question, what do I struggle to trust God with my family? Especially when I can't protect, control, or fix people that I love. Again, like Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. That one of the struggles of being a parent is coming to the realization that we can't control our children. You're not going to amen that, Nathaniel? Okay, he whatted that, which means that he was listening to his mom. Oh, we can't control you, right? No, okay. We can't control our children. We can't fully protect our children. I'm terrified when they get their driver's licenses, right? But we've got to let go. We cannot control. And they make their own decisions, and we've got to leave them to the Lord. And what happens when parents become over-controlling? So often just leads to rebellion. And that's just a parental thing. The good thing you can control your husbands for your wives, Of course we know that, right? little sarcasm there thrown at the end of the sermon, see if you're still awake. We can't control our family, nor should we. We need to do everything. We need to be the people God's called us to be. There's a prayer I've been praying every day this year so far of God, make me into a godly husband, father, and pastor. That God would make me the type of person that I need to be, and just trust the other things to fall into place. And so we need to surrender our family to the Lord. How about friends? Do I trust God with my relationships? Or do I rely upon people to give me security that only God can provide? That's one of the great, horrible things that we do when we start looking for our significance in what other people think about us. We think other people's power or position, if only that person would do this for me or that for me, or give me their affection, attention, money, hire me, whatever it may be. And we begin to look at people to do things that only God can provide, which is to provide security. How about finances? We could ask the question, what ways do money and financial pressure tempt me to trust my own efforts more than God's provision? And we're familiar with Matthew chapter 6, on how God provides for the sparrow and how much more would he provide for us. Why do we worry, saying, what shall we eat, what shall we drink, what shall we wear? Our Heavenly Father knows that we need these. He provides for us. We look to him to provide. How about our fitness? When our body feels fragile or out of control and we're going through debilitating illnesses or sickness, or people that we love are going through sicknesses, do we trust God with our health? Understanding that we're in his hands, and someday we're going to die and get a glorified body for all of us in Jesus. Do we trust God with our health, or do fear and anxiety take over? How about our future? What fears about the future, what do they reveal about what we're leaning on instead of trusting the Lord and his promises? Jeremiah 29:11 is a really good passage for that. When the Lord spoke through his prophet Jeremiah as his people were in slavery in Babylon, and this is all prophesied in advance because they're in process to go there. The Lord says, I know the plans I have for you. Enslaved as you may be, lacking hope, seeing the desolation of your hometown, wondering if there's any future, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not plans to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. And God has a plan for a hope in the future for all of us, perfectly revealed in Jesus Christ. And for all of us who've surrendered to the love and control of Jesus over our lives, putting our sin, our anxiety, our worries, or all of our failures at his feet, acknowledging his lordship and saying, Lord, I trust you with my future. I belong to you. I don't belong to myself. When we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and confess that God raised him from the dead, we will be saved. Do we trust the Lord with our future, or are we trying to control everything? And if we make that decision, we're going to be sabotaging ourselves of peace and joy, choosing anxiety and fear. It's an illusion. Or we can just trust the God who loves us to take care of us. So what will trusting the Lord in that area look like for you this week? If one of those, maybe you saw one of the F's in the previous slide that stuck out to you, maybe there's something else entirely. What would trusting the Lord in that area look like for you this week? It's choosing peace over anxiety, placing the outcome in God's hands instead of trying to control it ourselves. It means responding in prayer rather than in panic, and obedience rather than impulse. Resting in God's faithfulness instead of being ruled by our circumstances. Don't we want that? As I've been studying for this and praying, I'm like, that's exactly what I want. Preachers are learners too, right? And things that are reminders for you are reminders for me as well. We need to be reminded all the time that God is trustworthy and that we need to trust him instead of trying to handle it ourselves. I want to tell you a story you might be familiar with, but in the early 1880s, there's a young woman. Her name is Louisa. She went on a picnic with her husband and their young daughter, newly married, newlywed, young child. It was an ordinary day until it wasn't. While they were resting near the water, Louisa watched her husband rush in to rescue a boy who's struggling, who's drowning in the water. And her husband successfully rescued the boy, but he lost his life in the process. Louisa stood there watching her husband, the father to her young daughter, drown in heroic action to save this man, this stranger. In a single moment, she went from being married, newlywed, excited with a great future, to becoming a widow and a single mother. without safety net, 1880s. No clear future, just grief, questions, and the long road of learning of how to live again. And yet over time, she discovered, not the pain disappeared, but she discovered that life suddenly became interesting. God proved himself faithful again and again. As a single mother struggling to provide, wondering where the next meal is going to come from, and trying to have answers for her young daughter, she trusted her heart to the Lord, and God proved himself over and over again in the quiet and unseen places, in daily dependence and provisions that she couldn't explain. And out of that experience, not out of theory, but out of that experience, she wrote these words: "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus saith the Lord." That this song was written by a single woman, widow, mother, having undergone that horror. And that gives a lot of weight to the words, how I've proved him o'er and o'er, how God has over and over shown himself faithful and trustworthy. And then that line, "Oh, for grace to trust him more. I've trusted him, he's carried me through, and I want to trust him even more." That's the voice of someone who's still learning and depending upon the Lord, still trusting. Leads us back to you and me. Where's God inviting you and me to trust him more today?